welcome to another live event from The Economist. I'm Rachna Shanbhogue, The Economist's Business Affairs Editor, and today I'm joined by Tom Standage, editor of our annual publication, The World Ahead. He's going to give us a taste of what's in this year's edition, the events, trends, and technologies that we think will shape the coming year. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Hello, great to be here. Hello, everyone.
Now, Tom, before I hand it over to you, I'd like to give our audience a bit of a sense of what happens behind the scenes. Why does The Economist publish The World Ahead each year, and how is it different to the usual run of the paper?
So we've been doing this for 38 years, it turns out, and I think it's something that people associate with The Economist, being forward-looking, being predictive, being trend-spotting, joining the dots between things happening around the world, taking a global perspective. But what the annual does is it actually sort of narrows that focus in a way, because we're really only looking at next year. And so in some respects, The Economist will very often look far ahead. We just did that special report, for example, on longevity and whether we'll all be living to 120 and things like that. So we are very interested in the future and what it looks like. But this is in some ways rather more restricted, because it's just saying, what's going to happen in the next calendar year. So it's on brand, but it's a different twist.
And when did you start casting your mind to 2024? When did you start thinking about the annual, and who actually contributes?
So the process actually kicks off in May, and it's sort of hard to believe, really, but we start saying, oh my goodness, we've got to start thinking about coming year. And at that point, we have a meeting, and it's traditionally fueled by an awful lot of sticky buns and sugar and caffeine. And we kind of gather as many ideas as we possibly can from the editorial staff. Everyone is encouraged to drop in, even if only briefly, to say, oh, here's a thing that, I think we should be looking at for next year, or here's a trend, or here's an event I definitely know is going to happen. So it's the same people that are writing the weekly and writing for The Economist and appearing in our films and podcasts and all the rest of it. So it's the same crew of people. But it's also drawing on the expertise of the Economist Intelligence Unit. So we have forecasts for 80 countries and 15 industries. Then we also have invited writers. So this year we have, for example, Niall Ferguson and Condoleezza Rice on the new Cold War. We have Dr. Jaishankar, the Foreign Minister of India. We have Timnit Gebru, who is an AI ethicist and one of the authors of the Stochastics Parrots paper. And that's just some of the guests we have this year. So we have invited experts as well. And then we also have the super forecasters contributing, and they are the people who deploy the methods developed by Philip Tetlock, and they were essentially the victors in a contest organized by the US intelligence community to see who was best at geopolitical forecasting. And so they give us a handful of very sort of precise forecasts each year as well. So really it is quite a broad mix of views from internal and external sources. And my job is to sort of pull them all together and spot where they disagree with each other and try and make a coherent picture out of it all. And that's what I'm going to do today.
And just before we do that, tell us about the past year and what the World Ahead 2023 got right, and what took you by surprise.
As well as writing the editor's letter where I sort of sum up the trends, and I'm going to do the top 10 trends today, the other regular thing I have to do is write the piece on how we did. And if I look back at the 2023 edition, I think the main thing we got wrong, the biggest thing we got wrong, is in your part of the map, in fact, was on economics. Like many observers, we were very gloomy at the end of 2022 about the prospects for Western economies, and we expected recessions in America and Europe and Britain, and actually, those economies have done much better than expected, partly because of the mild weather, which meant that the energy shock wasn't as bad as expected, but also because in America, the economy has just been incredibly strong and the labour market's been incredibly strong. So that's the main thing we got wrong. And we got a couple of other things wrong as well. We said that China might start to loosen its zero COVID policy, but in fact they got rid of it completely right at the end of 2022, so before 2023 had even begun. But the consequences of that, we said that any loosening would be very difficult because you'd have a big exit wave and so on. So we did sort of point in the right direction on that thing. And of course, we didn't foresee. Nobody foresaw the attacks by Hamas on October the 7th. So we did have a Middle East view piece where we were talking about the Abraham Accords and the fact that the expansion of the Abraham Accords essentially involved turning a blind eye to the plight of the Palestinians, and that is exactly what the Hamas attacks have, seem to have been intended to put an end to. So those were the things we missed. I think we did better in other areas. So we were right that the war in Ukraine would accelerate the adoption of renewable energy, that essentially that conflict was most likely to turn into a grinding stalemate, which is what's happened. There was a lot of talk of peak China, and that has indeed happened because China's population has been overtaken by India's, and China's is declining, whereas India's is growing. Those sorts of things, demographics are sort of quite predictable, far out. And we were right on elections. For example, we said that Erdogan would win in Turkey, and that Peter Obi would probably lose in Nigeria. And institutionally, as fans of liberal democracy, we would have not liked those outcomes. We'd have liked the elections to have gone in another direction. But the forecasts were correct. The super forecasters also had a good year. And of the 9 predictions that they made, they essentially got them all right. So that was good too. Oh, and another thing we said was in Argentina, keep an eye on Javier Milei, which of course turned out to be not a bad bet either. And he's in the runoff on Sunday, and we'll see what happens.
Okay, so not a bad showing for 2023. Now over to you to tell us about 2024.
Brilliant. Okay, well, let's bring up the slides. Here we go. So I wear a bunch of hats at The Economist, and when I'm not being the deputy editor, I am editing our annual The World Ahead, and this is something I've been doing for a few years now. And as I mentioned earlier, we've been doing this for 38 years in total. But here are some of the recent covers, and so you can see the most recent cover there. And essentially, we've got all of these interesting sources of information. We've got the journalist predictions, we've got the EIU numbers, we've got the invited guests, we've got the super forecasters. And so I'm now going to give you my top 10. I'm going to take you through the editor's letter, which you can find in The World Ahead, and you can see that Andy Warhol has done the illustrations for us this year. But I'm going to essentially take you through this top 10. And this is where I'm really trying to join the dots, having been over all of the content that we've got in The World Ahead, the things that keep coming up. What are they? What are the most important? And so on. And the first one is to do with voting and elections and democracy. 2024 is a really unusual year in the sense that, I mentioned earlier that demography is one of the things that you can predict in advance. Another thing you can predict in advance is celestial mechanics. And so when there's going to be a solar eclipse and things like that. These are the sorts of things we really like for The World Ahead, because they absolutely have to happen. But one of the things about 2024 is that there are all of these elections that are due to take place. And by our calculations, we think this is the biggest year for elections in human history. So there are something like 75 or 76 elections taking place next year. And that means that more than half the people in the world live in countries where there's going to be a national election. And that's never happened before. And you can see where they are here. So essentially, this is driven by the fact that India, which is the biggest democracy in the world and also the most populous country in the world, is having an election next year. So is the United States, which is the second biggest democracy in the world. So that gives you 1.7 billion people living in countries having elections right there. You've also got Indonesia, which is the third biggest democracy in the world. That gets you up to 2 billion. And then if you throw in all these other countries as well, you can see that elections are happening in an enormous number of countries. However, there is more to democracy than voting, and more voting does not mean that there's more democracy. In theory, you might say, well, this is a great triumph for democracy and shows you how well democracy is doing. But in practice, an awful lot of these elections are not going to be free or fair. And if you look at the chart here, the colours show you what's happening. To the far right of the chart, the sort of dark red, those are the free and fair elections. And we think of the 75 or 76 or so, only 43 of them are going to be free and fair. And of those, 27 are the European parliamentary elections in the EU. So that shows you that an awful lot of these elections aren't fair. You can see that somewhere like Russia, which is to the far left, that's not even no one. We know what the outcome of that election is going to be. Vladimir Putin got 77% of the vote last time, and he's obviously going to win this time. But what's interesting is kind of in the middle, and in fact, even the US and India are counted by the EIU Democracy Index as flawed democracies. So there are ways in which we think that democracies could be improved. Maybe the opposition hasn't got all the freedoms it should have, or the press isn't as free as it should be, or whatever. There are various ways of measuring this, and essentially, the further to the left you go, the more flawed and authoritarian these countries are, in our view. So that's what we're showing you here. So clearly, there are going to be some elections where there's no chance at all of the outcome being unexpected. Paul Kagame in Rwanda, for example, got 99% of the vote last time there was an election. Guess what's going to happen next year? He's going to win. Some of the elections we think are interesting and particularly noteworthy. Mexico is going to elect its first female president next year because both of the leading candidates are women. And I think the big ones to watch are at the beginning and the end of the year. Taiwan has an election right at the start of the year where it will decide between a more sort of China-friendly candidate and a more independence-leaning candidate. But of course, the big one is the US election at the end of the year. And this is the point where US voters and, of course, the courts will give their verdicts in their own different ways on Donald Trump. And we think, and this is the super forecaster prediction, he has a 1 in 3 chance of winning. Presidential elections tend to be very close, and so it really is, pretty much a coin toss. And the result is likely to come down to a few tens of thousands of voters in a handful of swing states. But they may well be voting on local issues, but the consequences will be global, and this will affect everything from climate policy to military support for Ukraine. And in fact, the fact that the Russian election, is a foregone conclusion means that Vladimir Putin's fate actually depends more on American voters than it does on Russian voters. And I think that's one big consequence of this. Will support for Ukraine from America continue after the election? The other thing that we point out is that some China watchers think that there's a sort of window of vulnerability later in this decade. This is the point where China, which has, the PLA is under orders from Xi Jinping to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. And the concern is that America, which is beefing up its presence in the Indo-Pacific, that's really not going to kick in until the 2030s. And so some people say, well, there's this point in the late 2020s where China is more likely to make a move on Taiwan. And that means that whoever wins and becomes president in America in 2024 may be the president that ends up having to, essentially deal with a crisis over Taiwan and potentially a war with China. Anyway, going back, so the third trend is going back to Ukraine, is the role of Europe, because we've already seen that Republicans in Congress are obstructing further American aid to Ukraine, and enthusiasm for supporting Ukraine, certainly from the is diminishing very quickly. And that means Europe has to step up next year and provide Ukraine with the military and economic backing that it needs for what looks like it's going to be a long fight. And Vladimir Putin wants to string this out for as long as he can. His hope is that Donald Trump will win next year and then pull the plug on American support for Ukraine. And so Europe really does need to take this on. It needs to provide the military support and the economic support, and it also needs to lay out a path towards EU membership. And we've seen that process, stepping up a gear in the last few days. And actually, if you look at the numbers, the cumulative support from the EU plus Britain, Norway and Switzerland now exceeds that from America in both financial and military terms. But Europe has helped Ukraine by running down its own reserves of tanks and ammunition and missiles. And so it needs to really increase production capacity as well as providing funding. But this is the right thing to do to defend Ukraine against Russian aggression. And it also, of course, helps to ensure against the risk that Donald Trump will regain power and withdraw US support. The other conflict, of course, that's very much on our minds at the moment is in the Middle East. Hamas's attack on Israel and Israel's retaliation against Gaza have upended the region, and they've destroyed the idea that the world could continue to ignore the Palestinians' plight. So in recent years, since the 2020s, since 2020, we've had the Abraham Accords with several Arab states normalizing relations with Israel and essentially turning a blind eye to what was going on with the Palestinians. There were no concessions required from Israel, and it looked as though, and really until very recently, it looked as though Saudi Arabia was the next country that was going to sign up. The Abraham Accords are partly about building economic links, but with Israel, and Saudi Arabia is already a big investor in Israeli startups and things. But they're also a way of countering the common enemy of Iran. And it does look as though Hamas's aim and Iran's aim with the October the 7th attacks was to derail the Abraham Accords process. And so the big question for next year is whether that has happened. And of course, what's going to happen now? What's going to happen after the Israeli offensive in Gaza has finished? And paradoxically, it could actually offer a new chance for peace, because America has made it very explicit that its support for Israel is conditional on the revival of the peace process, which had really sort of become frozen for a very, very long time. So there's been this sort of lack of movement there, and so this terrible upsurge of violence that we've seen might paradoxically be a step towards a new chance for peace in that part of the world. And looking more broadly, it's not just in Ukraine and in the Middle East where we've seen conflict. America has had this plan to pivot to Asia for a long time and focus on its rivalry with China, and that's been derailed by the war in Ukraine and now Gaza. But essentially, we're seeing chaos in all sorts of places. The Sahel as well. Iran's proxies are thriving in states, failing states across the Middle East. And in Africa, you can walk from the Atlantic to the Red Sea through countries that have had coups just in the last 3 years. Azerbaijan has just had this very short war with Armenia in Russia's backyard. So we're seeing sort of frozen conflicts thawing all over the place. And one way of interpreting that is that America had this unipolar moment after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was the only superpower, but that period is now over, and we're now seeing other powers being more assertive. Russia, China, Iran, they're all actually working together on a lot of this. So China is buying a lot of Russian and Iranian oil. Iran is supplying drones to Russia. So another question for 2024 is how far will that alliance go? But I think, you can look at all this and say there are lots of parts of the world now where really nobody is in charge. That certainly looks to be the case in the Sahel. There's a sort of growing zone of impunity. So much as a lot of people dislike the idea of America as the global policeman, in much of the world now there is no policeman. And America has become the overstretched superpower. And we are looking at a more disorderly, more multipolar world. And of course, the big concern there is, can America deal with three crises at once? So it's got Ukraine and it's got the Middle East. But what happens if China says, aha, this is the time to make a move on Taiwan? Well, so far, of course, it hasn't. And this is a reminder that wars can be cold as well as hot. And we really are looking at a second Cold War. And this is a framing that we really resisted at The Economist. Because the original Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union didn't really involve any trade between the two sides. There was no trade to speak of. Whereas there is an enormous amount of trade and very closely linked supply chains between the West and China. And technology in particular is sort of a central front in this new Cold War. And we've seen America imposing increasingly tight restrictions on China's access to various kinds of advanced technology, microchips that you can use to build AI and that sort of thing. So what we're going to see next year is China is going to continue to look for loopholes in those rules, and it's going to continue to try to develop its own versions of these technologies. And the other thing that's happening in all of this is that Western firms are saying, well, we can see what happened when Russia went into Ukraine and Russia had sanctions imposed on it. If there is conflict over Taiwan and there are sanctions on China, we've got a big problem because we rely on China, maybe not as an end market. I mean, a lot of, some Western companies do. For Apple, China is a very, very important market. But mostly it's a place where stuff gets built. And so we've heard a lot from Western companies about trying to decouple supply chains from China. And our line at The Economist has been that a lot of this decoupling is in fact phony. It's not really happening. If you move assembly of electronics to Vietnam or to India, but a lot of the components are still really coming from China, then you haven't really decoupled, because you don't really know what's going to happen if there is conflict over Taiwan, and either China or the West, imposes restrictions on the flow of those components. So we've seen certainly Vietnam has done very well out of this, but I'm not sure that just moving assembly of electronic devices or whatever to Vietnam while still relying on Chinese products or components really helps. And if you're going to decouple properly, you need to have part of your supply chain that is entirely isolated from China, right down to the raw materials, and almost nobody has managed to do that. So this Cold War is fortunately still a Cold War, hasn't turned into a hot war, and with luck it won't. And we have seen the first meeting between Biden and Xi in San Francisco, and not much seems to have come out of it. But one of the points that Condoleezza Rice and Niall Ferguson make in their guest article for us is that we need to have more contacts between the militaries of America and China. This is what we had during the old Cold War as well. Though those direct military to military contacts were cut off after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in 2020. The Chinese were very unimpressed, and they broke off this formal contact. That one of the things, in fact, one of the few things that's come out of the Xi-Biden meeting is the re-establishment of those direct connections, and that's very good because that makes accidental escalation much less likely. So that's a good thing. But the fact is, relations between America and China are not good. Tensions over Taiwan are going up. China is doing more provocative, flights over the median line, flying drones around the whole island, all this sort of thing. So it's very much sort of Cold War vibes of the kind that I remember when I was growing up in the 80s, and it's come back. The other thing to bear in mind is that both camps are trying to woo those powers in the middle, the non-aligned countries that are, in many cases trying not to pick sides, or like Vietnam is trying to play both sides. And one of the reasons that they want to woo the middle powers, not the only one by any means, but one of the reasons is that in many cases, the resources we need for the clean energy transition are in the hands of middle powers in the global south. And that's my next trend. The clean energy transition is minting new green superpowers and redrawing the energy resources map. So suddenly countries are saying, we need to ensure that we've got access to things like lithium and copper and nickel in the future. We don't want to be reliant on China on the other side of a Cold War. Where are we going to get it from? And those resources suddenly matter a lot more, and oil and gas relatively matter less. And this competition for green resources is reshaping geopolitics and trade, and it's creating some unexpected winners and losers. So I think, most people are familiar with the idea that China has a lot of lithium, but other countries do too. Iran has just found a big deposit. Ghana's just opening its first lithium mine. And in fact, America, there's just been a big find of lithium in the US, I think on the Nevada, in Nevada somewhere, I think. Anyway, the point is that the map is more complicated than you might think, and it's in flux as well. So if you look at this chart, you can see at the bottom right there, New Caledonia is a big supplier of nickel. Who knew? And I think the main thing is that the map is continuing to change. So you've got nickel in New Caledonia, you've got copper in Pakistan. It seems that there may be large deposits of white hydrogen in France, which is where you get naturally occurring hydrogen. So you don't even have to electrolyze water, you just get hydrogen coming out of the ground. People thought this didn't really exist, but it turns out it might do. That's quite interesting as well. And then another thing to watch out for next year is the prospect of mining, deep sea mining on the sea floor, where you can find some very valuable metals like manganese lying around in nodules. And there's a ruling coming next year, and one way or another, I think we're going to start to see deep sea mining happening next year. So the point really is that these aren't places necessarily that you think of as energy resource powerhouses. We're used to thinking of the Gulf as a place with lots of hydrocarbons. But actually, the resources that people want now are in different places, and the shape of the map is changing, and who knows what it will end up looking like. Okay, on to economics now. And as I said earlier, Western economies did better than expected in 2023. The expected recessions did not occur. Now, of course, they could still happen, but there's the old joke that economists have successfully predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions. And this is because if you predict a recession is going to happen, you're always going to be right, because there's always going to be one eventually. And so the timing matters. And so I think, we and others predicted recessions for 2023. We may still see recessions in some places like the EU in 2024, but the joke is that the reason it's a joke is that the timing matters, and we were wrong about 2023. So it could still happen in 2024. The US does look like it has dodged a recession, though, and this is interesting because the orthodoxy for a long time has been that you can only kill off inflation by raising interest rates and triggering a recession, and the US seems to have killed inflation without triggering a recession so far, and it does seem to be heading for a soft landing so far. And when you look at people predicting the likelihood likelihood of a US recession is steadily ticking down. So be interesting to see whether that happens. But even if recessions are avoided, the fact that interest rates are higher for longer is still painful for companies and consumers alike. And I think the other thing to keep an eye on is, have we seen the back of the problems that we had in small and medium-sized banks earlier this year? So Silicon Valley Bank being the most famous, but actually we had a small number of these banks getting into trouble. And it tends to be these smaller and medium-sized banks are more exposed to bonds. So they bought bonds when rates were low, interest rates were low, because that was the right thing to do, and now it's not such a great idea. And they're also unduly exposed to commercial property. And as demand for commercial property shifts as a result of more people working from home more of the time, it may be that those smaller banks are the ones that end up in trouble. So I think if there was going to be a financial crisis next year, that would be a likely place where it might start. But the general picture is that things didn't go as badly as we expected to this year. And then another thing that we've talked about a lot this year is AI, and artificial intelligence, I think, sort of gets real in 2024. Everyone is talking about it, companies are adopting it, regulators are regulating it, and technologists continue to improve it. But I think mainly people worry about it. And those worries come in four main areas: the sort of existential risk, is AI going to go rogue and kill us all? The bias and discrimination risk, which is, are the existing systems that we have actually already causing problems? Are they discriminating when it comes to things like facial recognition used by law enforcement, or if you've got a system that decides who gets bank loans, is it actually being fair? Another concern that people have, and I think that's particularly relevant for 2024 with all those elections, is the risk that these systems will be used to generate disinformation. And then I think the thing that people worry about, that most people worry about most immediately, is the risk to their jobs. Is a machine going to take away their job? And I think a lot of the debate we've had in 2023 has frankly been a bit silly. I think there's a good case to be made that the arguments over existential risk are basically a distraction. They're a decoy by the big companies that stand to benefit if we all pay attention to that. I think if you're a big provider of AI technology, you'd much rather that people spent their time worrying about theoretical risks in the future than looking at the direct impact of what your technology is doing now, whether that's, is it producing biased or discriminatory results? Is it infringing intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the kind of look at the scary, killer robots could be coming over the horizon tactic is to some extent a way of distracting attention from the real risks that exist today. And I'm reminded of a quote about Robert Oppenheimer, and this year, because of the film, we've all become a lot more familiar with Robert Oppenheimer, and of course Barbie, but that's a separate matter. But Oppenheimer, having played this pivotal role in the development of atomic weapons, it was said of him by John von Neumann that some people profess guilt to claim credit for the sin. So Oppenheimer sort of apologized for his role in creating these great weapons. But von Neumann's point was, by apologizing for it, Oppenheimer was drawing attention to how clever he was and how he had made this amazing thing. And I get very much a sense of that with when sort of tech bros like Elon Musk or Sam Altman talk about the risk of this technology. They're sort of saying, this thing I've made is so awesome that it could destroy us all, and they're reminding you of their own awesomeness in the process. So what I hope will happen in 2024, and I think we're starting to see some signs of this, is that the debate will start to focus more on real world harms that exist now and things that actually we might want to regulate now, rather than hypothetical risks that might exist in the future but may not. And we'll start to see regulations, from the EU and other places like that. And so I think there's also going to be an intensifying debate over the best regulatory approach. So do you want a sort of IPCC-like body like we have for climate change? Do you want a sort of FDA, that regulates drugs in America? Or some people say we need an IAEA, the sort of nuclear COP approach for AI, and they need to be able to sort of parachute into any tech company and say, show me the inside of your AI. So I think we'll see see more debate over that. And I think we'll also get more research about the real impact of AI on jobs. And so far, this research has been really interesting because a characteristic of a lot of technology is that the benefits of it accrue to people who are more educated and are more skilled. So if you're already literate and you already understand technology and a new technology comes along, the chances are you can adopt it and you can get a benefit from it. And so you get more inequality from the deployment of more technology. And there are some really interesting signs that AI might be different because the AI systems that have been deployed in things like call centers, when software engineers are writing code, when consultants are coming up with new business plans for their clients, in all of those cases, there have been studies where they've been given AI sidekicks to see what it does, and it increases their productivity. But what's really interesting is that the high performers don't really gain very much. They don't get much benefit from this. It's the middling performers who do a lot better. They're able to produce a lot more stuff, produce better work, and so it's actually an equalizer. And that's really interesting because it potentially means that this is a technology that could reduce inequality rather than increase it. So we'll have to see, whether that's borne out by other things. But I think that's a very, very interesting sign. And the other thing I'd say is that the biggest single impact of this technology is already with us, and it's sort of invisible. It may be starting to show up in productivity figures, but essentially it's that you can write software code much, much faster using this. People say that the productivity of software engineers goes up by 30 to 50% is the sort of consensus figure. But there was this very interesting natural experiment that occurred in Italy earlier this year. Italy banned ChatGPT, the most famous large language model, for a week because there was the privacy scare that it was leaking customer details. But what this meant was that programmers in Italy did not have access to it for a few days. And you could see how much code was being checked into GitHub, which is a big online code library, by people in Italy. And it fell by 50% during that period. So that does suggest that programmers have already adopted this. And I speak as one of them. I've been doing some coding again this year. My background's in computer science. Occasionally I want to do something and pick up whatever the latest tools are. And I was writing on a new system in a new language this year. And so I was using ChatGPT as my sidekick. It's like, well, how do you do this in this language? And how do I do this? And how would I do that? And it just gives me little bits of code and I can plug them in and see how it works. And I'm a mediocre programmer, but it made me much more effective and much faster. So I think this is potentially the biggest benefit of this technology happening right now, which is it becomes faster to develop new products, new digital products, and that's a very good thing. Okay, finally, this has all been a bit depressing. I'm the first to admit that. So it would be lovely if there was some event next year where everyone could put aside their ideological differences and say, oh yes, we're all members of the same human family, and this is something that the Olympics often has that effect on people. So might this happen with the Paris Olympics? Well, alas, I fear that the Olympics may be overshadowed by arguments about whether Russian and Belarusian athletes should be able to compete and under what terms and what flag and all that sort of thing. And Russia is in fact going to have its own rival games called the Friendship Games, so it doesn't want to attend anyway. So that, I'm afraid, has already become a political football. What about astronauts returning to the moon? And when I say returning to the moon, sort of. They're not going to land, but you can see the crew here. This is the crew, and the plan is this will happen in November 2024. It may get moved into 2025, but the current schedule is that it's in November 2024. They would go round the back of the moon, so they would orbit. They would go round the back, and then they would come back to Earth orbit. But this is to test the spaceships and so on before they try a landing. And this is what we saw with the Apollo program, that they sort of gradually worked up to the landing. And this crew would include the first black man, the first woman, and the first non-American to leave Earth orbit. So again, that might be a great cause for celebration. But again, I fear that this will turn into a sort of reminder that the original space race was part of the Cold War. It was about America demonstrating its technological superiority. So again, I'm not really sure that people going to the moon going back to the moon, or the vicinity of the moon at least, is necessarily going to lead to an outburst of unity. Another one, we seem to have a lot of cricket fans at The Economist, and many of them are very excited about the fact that the men's 2020 World Cup is happening it's being hosted by the West Indies and America next year, and so the hope is that this will mean that America will sort of catch the cricket bug. So maybe, but I fear that people hoping for some moment of global unity will be stumped. Anyway, you can find out about all of these trends and much more in the World Ahead 2024. It's on our website now at economist.com/World Ahead 2024. It's in the app. It's in the print edition that comes out tomorrow, which is the thickest print edition. I went into the archives and found out it's the thickest print edition we've had since the height of the dot-com boom, since October 2000. But anyway, those are my top 10, and I wish you the best of luck in navigating the ups and downs of the coming year.
Well, thank you, Tom. That was very wide-ranging, and I'm sure the audience appreciates your efforts to find some sort of good news to expect in 2024. And perhaps if they have some, they might send them in the Q&A function soon, because we'd certainly love to hear them. Now, just before we turn to questions from the audience, I'd just like to point you all in the direction of the World Ahead on the Economist website. As Tom said, the World Ahead is also bundled into our print edition, making it a bumper issue if you're expecting it to arrive in the post. But all the articles are also available to subscribers online, and the QR code on screen now should take you straight there. We'll also send you a link by email after this session. But don't go anywhere just yet, because we've got some questions from our viewers, and there are lots rolling in. And Tom, perhaps unsurprisingly, the first lot are about Donald Trump. Lots of subscribers, including Charles, Ned, and Dario, are asking what a potential second term for Trump might mean for America. And Mauricio asked specifically what it might mean for climate. For climate action, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said earlier on, technically, this is outside the context of the world in 2024, because whoever wins the election will take office in January 2025. However, that so much of what we were writing about for 2024 hinges on what happens in America. That the way we've dealt with it is that the cover article in this bumper issue, and the cover itself, it's Donald Trump's shadow sort of falling across the world, and so the cover leader, which is not actually part of the World Ahead, but is the cover leader in the weekly issue, deals with exactly that question. And what would the implications be for America, and what would they be for the world, and just how sort of frightening this is. And it's very odd, because this is a sort of topic that's the shape of Donald Trump is sort of defined by his absence in the World Ahead 2024, because we're just focusing on what might happen next year, and of course all those consequences would really start to kick in the year after. On climate, there is a big question. I mean, he really doesn't like the IRA, the supposedly the Inflation Reduction Act, but actually the biggest bit of climate legislation ever passed. And there is also, I mean, more broadly, there is a sort of green lash underway from populist right wingers like Donald Trump, but also in other places as well. We've seen this in Germany. We saw a bit of it in Britain, where the action against climate change is now taken to be a sort of, they're trying to take away your freedom to own a big truck, and they're trying to make you buy an electric car. And this is all a sort of elite conspiracy. In Germany, there was a big fuss about new rules over heat pumps. And the right wing parties made a lot of that, and I think what's interesting, and this sort of connects with my point about the green resources as well, the fact that countries are worried about where they're going to get green resources from and securing those supplies, and the fact that right wing populists think there are votes in sort of kicking up a fuss about these pro-climate policies is, I think, weirdly sort of a good thing, because what this means is that we've moved on from saying, is climate change real, or do we need to do anything about it? We've sort of moved on to arguing about who is going to bear the costs of it and how we're going to deal with the clean energy transition, rather than if. So yes, obviously Donald Trump would set back those efforts enormously. But I think it's interesting that the general tenor has become sort of arguing about the nature of the clean energy transition rather than whether it's necessary at all. And then the other thing that's changed, for a long time you heard from Americans, particularly on the right, and people who were skeptical about climate change, well, it doesn't really matter what we do in the West because China is, China is just so polluting, and China's always going to favour growth over everything else. And that's also less true with every passing day. China has last year, 2022, China installed as much wind power as exists in the whole of America, and this year it's installed twice as much, so 2 Americas worth of wind power. Next year, one of the things that's going to happen is that renewable energies will overtake coal to become the single biggest source of electricity. So yes, there's still a lot of coal being burnt in China, but China is actually moving very quickly in this direction. So Donald Trump would slow things down and it would be bad, but I kind of, people are assuming the energy transition is going to happen now. I don't think he can stop it.
Sticking with the climate theme, JP Blake wants to know what you make of the electric vehicle transition to using electric vehicles. Will adoption take off or will it stall?
So this is a really interesting debate because particularly in America, EVs are sort of piling up on dealer lots, and people are saying, "Oh, everyone's gone off EVs; it's just a fad." And I think JP Morgan has got this prediction of like EV penetration in America is now going to peak at 10% or 15%. I don't think this is true. I think, and I speak as someone who's in the market for an EV right now, so I've been looking at this. The problem is that EVs are, if you want to have decent range on them, and people do want sort of 250, 300 miles, then you need to have a big battery, and then that means you need to have a big car, and also the battery is expensive, and so on. So it turns out that the sweet spot for selling an electric car is sort of 50,000 or 50,000 pounds or dollars and upwards, and that way you can make it really big. It's an SUV, it's got good range, and so there are lots of electric cars. If you've got 50,000 to spend, you can get a really nice electric car, but most people don't. And the problem is that the more affordable models aren't showing up. And not all of them, but an awful lot of people who are willing to be early adopters have said, yes, I'm so keen on having an electric car, and also I can afford it, so I'm going to buy one of these expensive ones. But if you've been waiting for the price to drop to sort of 30,000 or 25,000 for an electric car that's got more than 150-mile range, then you're probably still waiting. And I think that's the problem. It's not a demand problem. I think it's a supply problem, which is that the car makers aren't moving fast enough. Interestingly, the car makers who are moving in this direction very quickly are the Chinese ones. So one of the things that's going to happen next year, and again, we have a section called Trend Lines, which looks at sort of charts where an interesting thing, a line's going to cross another line or something like that. One of the things that's going to happen next year is that China is probably going to overtake Japan and Germany to become the world's biggest car exporter, and that's entirely because China has jumped on the electric vehicle transition as its opportunity. Essentially, it resets competition in the car industry, because the thing that in particular German and Japanese car makers have always been good at, making really good engines, making really good transmissions, none of that matters anymore, because you don't need to have them in an electric car. Electric car is essentially a smartphone on wheels, and what you need is a good battery, and you need to be able to assemble electronics, and these are things that Chinese companies are good at. So in Britain, the best value electric cars are the ones made in China. So things like the MG and the Polestar and the Volvo and so on. Also, they're not about to be hit with a 10% tariff from Europe for not including enough European components. So this is a really interesting transition. The other thing that's going to happen next year is that BYD, a Chinese company, is going to overtake Tesla as the world's biggest producer of EVs. So if you look at what Chinese companies are doing, they've absolutely got this right. But if you want a big American or big European brand to sell you an electric car, the chances are they'll sell you one, but it'll cost you 50 or 60,000 of whatever your local currency is. So I think it's a demand problem, a supply problem, not a demand problem. And I think we are going to see more affordable electric cars coming through. It's just they're not here yet. So it's going to be 25, 26 possibly before that happens.
Let's turn to geopolitics. We've got a question from subscribers including Tina, Brian and Dale. And they're asking, this again may not be a question for 2024, maybe something further out, how likely is China to try and invade Taiwan?
Oh, the perennial question. Well, not in 2024, I think is our position. Although we've we've been caught out by Russia invading Ukraine. We didn't see that coming either. And of course, this year the Hamas's attacks as well. But no, I still think it's not immediately likely. But I think a lot of a lot of it hinges on this sort of combination of whether China thinks that it's got more of a chance, whether its chances of succeeding in taking Taiwan are going to diminish in the future, or going to increase. At the moment, it's building up its military, and it thinks its chances are higher. I think one of the things that happened, there's debate about this, but the invasion of Ukraine by Russia may have sort of made it slightly less likely that China would move, nearer rather than further out, simply because it showed that when a big power invades a smaller country next door, things don't always go according to plan. And Russia actually has a land border with Ukraine, which should make it much easier. That's much harder than going across the Taiwan Strait. So Xi Jinping has, said to the PLA, I want you to be ready to do this by 2027. And they will only do it if they are pretty sure that they can win quickly and decisively. And so reducing the likelihood of conflict means that the West has to make it clear that it will support Taiwan. Taiwan needs to actually change its approach. It's spent too much money on sort of fancy things like fighter jets and ships, and actually it needs to buy boring things like anti-tank weapons and that sort of thing. It needs to change its approach to conscription and so on. And whether it goes in that direction really does depend on the election result in January. It's possible that if a more China-friendly candidate wins, people will say, "Oh, well, the likelihood of a Chinese attack has gone down, and that's fine." But there's a sort of danger of complacency in that Taiwan won't take the actions necessary to deter any future attack. So yeah, I think the main thing to watch for next year is essentially how the election changes that argument, and whether the election makes whether that appears to change the calculation for China, and whether it makes China more belligerent or less. And so that's the near term thing to watch. But yeah, after that, who knows?
Well, let's stick with the wars that are raging, because there are lots of questions coming in from subscribers, and that's definitely keeping our colleagues busy. Richard, John, and Victoria have all asked similar questions. So, what is the likelihood that America, as well as Israel's neighbouring states, might be pulled into the conflict with in Gaza?
Again, that's the big question. I think. I think my sense is that concern about this turning into a broader regional conflict has sort of gone down in the last couple of weeks. That Iran it wants to essentially keep its powder dry. There hasn't been an attack in the north by Hezbollah. Yes, there's been provocations and so on, but so far that doesn't seem to be happening. So let's hope that continues to be the case, and this doesn't turn into a broader regional conflagration. But this is a very, very unpredictable part of the world, so you can never be sure.
On Ukraine, there's a set of questions as well. Paul and Bruce both ask whether Europe has sufficient capacity to augment its military capabilities and to bolster Ukraine.
It's not just a question of ramping up supply in existing factories in Europe. I think we probably need more capacity. So one of the things that Europe could be doing, for example, is investing in basically weapons factories in Ukraine itself. So that's the kind of thing that needs to happen. The problem is essentially that no one expected this to happen, and the rate at which you can get through these munitions is much higher than people expected. And then the other thing, of course, is this is particularly a problem for America rather than Europe. But if you're providing anti-missile systems to Ukraine, but now Israel wants some too, please, or you need to put them around, American assets in the Middle East, then you're being stretched in two different directions, and so. And then the anti-ship systems. I mean, there are lots of these things where the way that the calculations that people made about how many missiles you'd need and so on have not turned out to be that the amount of ammunition that there's being burnt through in Ukraine is extraordinary. So yes, there's definitely a need for not just ramping up production, but actually more capacity to produce more weapons.
Now, moving away from war, we have a question from Hélène, who's a 16-year-old student in China, and she asks, what steps can teenagers take to keep up with global changes and to navigate the evolving landscape?
Well, apart from reading The Economist, of course.
Of course.
Yeah, I think reading as widely as possible, and being exposed to as wide a point of view as possible, and reading critically, is the crucial thing. And the great thing about, the media environment today is extremely noisy, and there's a lot of misinformation around. But students today have access to more information than students did in the past. You really can get to more information. The crucial thing is to learn the skills of being able to differentiate between a trustworthy and an untrustworthy source, and to say, well, who's saying this and what's their agenda and who pays their bills, and can I believe this video, of is it really what it says it is, and so on. So the open source intelligence movement is very interesting, the way they verify things and so on. And I think we are seeing, it's in some ways it's interesting that that sort of thing has become so contentious. That's sort of a good sign, because that means people are paying more attention. And when people say, this video from Gaza, it shows this, and other people say, no, it doesn't. And the fact that we're having the debate about the trustworthiness of different sources and so on is useful. Because I think, certainly when I was growing up, there were only 3 channels on the TV, and there weren't very many newspapers, and most people didn't read multiple newspapers. You can now readers are much more promiscuous now. They read a lot more sources, and of course that means they read sources that they disagree with much more, and then you get sort of the fights in the comments and all the rest of it. But that is, again, a sort of sign of progress, because it means that people are reading more widely and exposing themselves to wider points of view. So I don't really believe in the sort of filter bubble view, because if the filter bubble view was true, then people wouldn't necessarily see things that they disagree with quite so much. And I think the fact that you get sort of such vitriolic fights online is a sign of people being exposed to a wide range of opinions that they very often disagree with.
Well, you found the silver lining there in something that can often be quite nasty. And what you said dovetails quite nicely, actually, with questions from Ralph and Stuart, who are both asking about what AI and new technology means for fake news, and how, in turn, that means that governments should be thinking about regulating tech.
So this is a concern, and we did a cover on it recently, where we looked at the implications for democracy and whether this is going to pose a threat. Because we've already seen some examples of deep fake videos that people have tried to use in election campaigns, and of course the ones we've heard about have been the ones that have been identified, and people have said, "Oh, this is a fake," and so on. I'm sort of in two minds about this, because on the one hand, I think that's a good sign. But on the other hand, by definition, if there were things that were, fooling people and people haven't noticed, then those are the ones we wouldn't know about. And if you go back to the 2016 election in America, the idea that there was sort of nefarious social media influence happening there, that there were sort of groups on Facebook that were funded by Russia or whatever. Essentially, we didn't find out about any of that until afterwards. And even today, there isn't a consensus on whether it actually made any difference. So I think the challenge with AI, and particularly with all these elections next year, is that we're not going to know about that right away. We're only going to find out after the fact. And even then, it may be very hard to tell whether it made a difference or not. So the historical analogy with social media not being terribly well regulated, or indeed at all, and then having these effects that we still argue about today, suggests that I think we may see something quite similar with AI as well, and trying to sort of watermark things. Essentially, that doesn't work. The watermarking systems are the systems that claim to be able to tell you whether images or text come from an AI. They're really, really unreliable. They have a very, very high false positive rate. So I'm afraid technology is not the answer either. So I think I go back to sort of media literacy and learning to view things critically and say, where's this come from? What's its provenance? Why should I believe them? And again, for publications like us, which have a direct link to our subscribers, we deliver information directly to our subscribers through our app. It's not going through some algorithm. It's not, we're not reliant on clicks and advertising. So we have a different model. But one of the things that I hope our readers take from that is that that means they can tell that when we say something, it really is coming from us. They may disagree with it, and that's great, and that's fine. But at least you don't have to say, well, hang on, is this really from The Economist, or is somebody trying to trick me, or etc., etc. So that's one of the ways that you can check the provenance of things is when you're getting them directly from the source. And of course, there are lots of other places that you can get information like that from.
The conversation has really ranged over a really wide terrain, and the questions that we've received from the audience have been fantastic. We've got time for one last one, which I'm going to put to you. What's your favourite nugget of information that you've come across while editing The World Ahead this year? Something that's really made you go, wow, that's a stunning fact.
That is a really good question. Let me just have a quick look around.
There's a whole 90 pages you have to remind yourself.
Yes, I know, exactly. I wish you'd let me know in advance, because it's it's a really good question. What's the fact that I've been quoting to? Well, I suppose actually I've just been like a cracked record about this, but it is this. We spotted it quite early on. It's this fact that more than half the world's population will live in a country that has a national election next year, and that's the first time that's happened in human history, and that is kind of amazing. I mean, obviously, a lot of those democracies are flawed, but that is kind of stunning. And when we first say that to people, they're like, "Oh, really?" And it's so I suppose that would be the single biggest thing, and it is also, in a way, the single biggest thing about next year. That's the big question: what happens in these elections, and in particular, what happens in America's election.
So if you're going to remember one number from this conversation, 4 billion is the one to remember. That's the important number
billion, yes, I think
for
it's
2024.
4.17 billion, but yeah, exactly. So it's a number of people who live in countries having national elections. So that includes the European Parliament elections. It includes municipal elections where the whole country votes, which is what's happening in Brazil and Turkey, and so on. So yes, I think I still think that's quite a big deal.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to find out more about our upcoming subscriber events, please click the link. On the same page, you can also find recordings of previous events, including a look at the rise of protectionism around the world. See you next time.